Thank you, Mr. Chairman, so much. And nothing is more bipartisan than the scourge of robocalls. This is something that unites everyone in America. We realize that something very bad has happened, that there is a sinister side of cyberspace, that really terrible things can happen as well as very good things. And when I was authoring the Telecommunications Consumer Protection Act back in 1991, we were in a relatively prosaic era, it turns out, in terms of robocalls. And the goal then was to make sure that people, whether at home or on their mobile phones, consumers should not be subject to intrusive and unsolicited calls. But this precious zone of privacy and control is under massive attack today because technology has evolved. Scammers can now easily robocall consumers en masse using technology as basic as a modern smartphone. That's all they need. They just need a smartphone, and they're in business in sending tens of thousands of unwanted calls to people. And the fraudsters can easily spoof their numbers in which they conceal their actual identity and instead make it seem like the call is coming from someone in your neighborhood when it's coming from someplace, as Senator Gardner is saying, unknown and more likely than not international. But it's been disguised as it's coming into people's home. And in March, as the chairman mentioned, consumers received an estimated 5.2 billion robocalls, and more than 55 million came to my constituents in Massachusetts. And the onslaught of robocalls has rattled consumers' confidence in their mobile devices. Caller ID isn't trusted. Important calls go unanswered. Innocent Americans are defrauded. Robocalls are a menace in our country. And just last week, this committee sent a clear message to fraudulent robocallers: your days are numbered. The committee unanimously passed the Traced Act, bipartisan legislation that has received the unanimous support of this committee, and we thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your incredible work in putting together that coalition. In stopping robocalls, however, requires a simple formula: authentication, blocking, and enforcement. And this bill does achieve all three. And it's received, and we thank you, Mr. Attorney General, for your support. The Attorneys General of all 54 states and territories Attorneys General, all of the Federal Communications Commissioners, all of the Federal Trade Commissioners, major industry associations, and leading consumer groups. So let me go to you first, Ms. Saunders. Estimates suggest that this year almost half of all calls to mobile phones will be from spoofed numbers. Half of all calls to mobile phones in America in a year will be from spoofed numbers. How will the Traced Act address the pressing challenge to the authenticity of our telephone networks?
Senator Markey, thank you for the question and thank you for your leadership on this issue. The Traced Act will require that the phone companies originating the phone calls will validate that the caller ID matches the actual phone number from which the call is coming. And that will bring us much farther along the road to ensuring that we can believe our caller IDs and we will know who is calling us.
So, there's an enforcement working group to identify better opportunities to better prosecute illegal robocallers. So, Attorney General Peterson, what enforcement challenges do you face, and how do you think the working group could help alleviate those challenges?
Well, I think the working group, among the Attorneys General, this interagency working group is going to be very important. As I said, already 43 state AGs have come together and want to coordinate with the feds as how best we can collectively use federal law and state law. What are the best forums? What are the best investigative tools? So the problem is so significant that in order to have any opportunity to be effective, I think there's there's got to be this combined effort. That's why we were very encouraged to see the specific language in the bill with regards to the interagency working groups.
Yeah, and again, can you, once again, just state how many, what percent of all the complaints that come to your office are with regard to unwanted calls?
For us, it's over 60%, but I know every state's a little bit different, but the volume is what's so significant. And probably in the last 2 years, how that volume has just accelerated at a rate with the technology and the accessibility that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, so, Mr. Rupi, the Trace Act establishes binding requirements for telephone providers to adopt call authentication and blocking technologies. What type of impact will the adoption of these protections have on curbing the meteoric rise in the number of unwanted robocalls?
Thank you for that question, Senator, and thank you for your leadership on this issue and this bill. And I think the Trace Act will do two important things. One, is Attorney General Peterson noted, and Ms. Saunders, it will authenticate that number. It will restore trust in that number. And that's important to both consumers and on the analytics side as we look for, try to separate the good calls from the bad calls. Second thing it'll do, it'll enhance traceback. And to Senator Gardner's point, U.S. Telecoms Industry Traceback Group can find these individuals. We've traced them back to Croatia, India, Dominican Republic. We can find them. And, there have been enforcement actions against call centers in India, and I would encourage those types of actions, which were, facilitated by the FTC.
Thank you. So I thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I thank Ranking Member Schatz and Cantwell, Chairman Wicker. This has been bipartisan. There are no blue robocalls or red robocalls. There are just irritating robocalls, and that's why it's so important that we take action. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So let me. There's an entire industry out there solely predicated on contacting consumers by any means possible, and the only thing preventing these callers from bombarding the public and unlimited number of unwanted calls is the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, and consent is the bedrock of the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, and while technology may change, the key principle does not. And therefore, it is the FCC's obligation to use its authority to adapt to changing technologies and ensure consumers have robust, enforceable protections against the onslaught of unwanted and abusive calls and texts. And their work is more important now than ever because the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals struck down portions of the FCC's 2015 rules, which updated protections for the smartphone era. And while the court case was a setback, the spirit and intent of the TCPA is always very clear. Callers must have affirmative permission from the consumer before using auto dialers, which are technologies that can call and text countless consumers at one time. And consumers should always have reasonable means to revoke consent to say no from receiving any more calls or texts. So, Ms. Saunders, is there any reason why the Federal Communications Commission cannot use its authority under the TCPA to ensure consumers have an easy way to revoke consent and require callers using auto dialers to receive permission before calling or texting a consumer?
Thank you for the question, Senator Markey. The issue before the FCC, there's a number of issues, the two big issues you've just identified. One is how to define or how to interpret the definition for auto dialer. The reason the ACA case was sent back to the FCC by the D.C. Circuit Court was that it said that the 2015 FCC order was too broad and that as it read, it covered all smartphones. The FCC now has before it a number of comments from consumer groups and industry arguing that concept. And we have pointed out to the FCC that smartphones, as they come from the factory, do not have the capacity, the current capacity, to make automated calls. So to quibble with you slightly, Senator Markey, you said that smartphones could be automated dialers. that is not the case unless they add applications. And that's a critical distinction to make for the FCC. If the FCC were to include all smartphones, the case would be sent back again. But we think we've shown to them how they can avoid that. If the FCC does what the industry wants and defines automated dialers as the U.S. Chamber and other callers have asked, the definition will not cover any of the dialers out there. The consequences will be that all these automated calls will be completely unregulated, and there will not be any way to say stop because the TCPA won't apply to them.
Okay, so your response is that the Federal Communications Commission has clear authority,
Yes, sir.
and if strong protections are not established, consumers would lose their right to provide and revoke consent for many calls. And I agree with that. And that's why so many members of the Senate are communicating with FCC Chairman Ajit Pai to adopt key protections, a comprehensive definition of auto dialer, ensuring all callers must receive permission before robocalling or robotexting a consumer, and preserving a consumer's right to revoke consent should they no longer wish to receive calls or texts. And if the FCC fails to fulfill their legislative mandate, it's going to be imperative for this committee once again to take action in order to ensure that consumers always have the right to say no to robocalls.
Yes, may I respond? Senator Markey, you yourself wrote a letter. You've written several letters to the FCC, but you specifically wrote a letter on this point, which we appreciate because it supports the consumer's view of the necessity for the FCC to appropriately interpret the statutory definitions.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.